Hi, this is the Philosophical Angle program, and I am your host, Chris Angle. And along with me is my co-host, Rick Samuelson, a venture capitalist on the West Coast. And Rick graduated from Yale and from Wharton, and joins us today in a discussion of the terrible events in England. We're going to call it, the concept we're going to discuss is terrorism versus diversity versus goodness. And the application will be the terrorism in England this past week. Just to give you a preliminary introduction, the Philosophical Angle program analyzes the nature and essence of concepts being used in current media, and the purpose of the show is to add a philosophical dimension to topics being discussed in current media. And so, as we discussed, or as we mentioned here, this week's events of terrorism in England reminds us of the problem of inviting diversity through immigration into our respective countries. We have often heard representatives of the left, such as former President Obama, declare that diversity is good for America, and diversity is who we are, and that's a direct quote. He often said that. And they further state, these politicians, that America was built on immigration. And Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, has also declared that the same statement, declaring that diversity is necessary for America. Well, is diversity good for America, England, or any of the other Western countries? So I think we should explore this topic. It's pretty important in light of the terrorism of England in England this last week. First of all, this declaration by the politicians really states that diversity is equal goodness for the respective country. So what does diversity start with? Well, obviously diversity means variation. And what kind of variations are there? When it comes to human beings, there is racial variation and cultural variation. In essence, there is a biological variation, and there is a cultural variation. And taking a look at biological variation, we look at the human genome, and there really isn't much variation across the human sapien spectrum of genetics. It would seem that the only variation really is superficial, which we could see on the exterior of the humans, and therefore there's some racial variation producing some visual and some visual identification characteristics, and this variation relative to basically relative to the various continents in which they evolved, but overall it's superficial, and because it is superficial, we can pretty much conclude that diversity is neither good nor bad for America on this level. It's totally neutral. It doesn't matter. You can have it or not have it, no impact. But as I mentioned before, there's another aspect of diversity which could be cultural diversity. And so what is culture, really, first of all? And culture is that which we produce. And there is behavioral culture, and there is physical culture. Behavior culture is that which we produce in our behavior, naturally. That is how we interact with each other in our society. An example of behavior culture would be the words that we employ in our language. Another example would be our handshake as opposed to a bow in the Eastern world. Basically, it is how we behave when we cooperate with others in our society. Physical culture is that which the respective society produces, its goods and services. Examples of this would be the architecture of buildings, or any kind of the products that we produce, such as our technologically oriented products, any of the basic products and services. So now we have to discuss and understand what is the meaning of good. And we're going to define good as that which brings us up away from misery. All life struggles to bring itself up away from misery. So now that we have the definition of good, we have the definition of culture, and now we have the definition of diversity. But let's compare these and see where it takes us. Okay, in the human biomass, there is almost no diversity genetically, only superficially, as we mentioned, and on the exterior of the organisms. And internally, it's also slight. Also, there's a tiny bit of variation on the exterior, perhaps, and relative to the total size of the biomass, diversity is really almost negligible. So we can conclude that as far as the genetic diversity and the makeup of the biomass, it's negligible. So the next type of diversity we have to say is cultural, and there are two types of cultural influences, as the behavioral and the physical, and these and then culture is that which we produce, and these cultures are very different from that of the United States, Western Europe, or Africa, and elsewhere. And anthropological ethnographies throughout history have shown that there are some significant variations in behavioral culture, and any particular cultures. And we could ask ourselves, are any particular cultures better, one better than the other? Is there not any particular supreme culture? As an aside here, in our little explanation, I should explain that behavioral culture is how a society produces respect of its societal members. Societal human behavior needs respect in order to indicate to other individuals how much they consider others when they try to cooperate with each other. And we cooperate with each other in order to produce goods and services, which brings the societal members up away from misery, and which is our definition of good. So when we're reading world ethnographies, it pretty much shows us that when it comes to intra-societal members and their behavior, cultures are all fairly equal. But please be aware that we're speaking of pure ethnographies, not how the political ideologies treat their subject people. So all cultures have behavioral mechanisms whereby respect is generated. However, there is variation, a significant variation by cultures for the production of respect of individuals for societies extraterritorially. That is, a society might have one type of respect for intra-societal members and another one extraterritorially. This difference in variation is quite amazing. It's quite stark, and it can be quite different throughout the world. Pre-World War II society of Japan indicates that respect of peoples outside their culture was minimum at best. There's some their behavior in China was extraordinary. But after World War II, the culture of Japan changed so that their respect for people extraterritorially became increasingly commensurate to inside their culture. And there are other examples. Obviously, there's a significant variation in these extraterritorial respect that they emote by any one nation for the peoples outside of their society. So all we have to do is look at the history of war to see that variation. So I think we conclude that the study of the ethnographies show that the extraterritorial attitudes of people when it comes to immigration should be considered in the diversity of immigration coming into any particular country, whether it's the United States or any of those of Western Europe or elsewhere, throughout the world. And the United States and many of the European countries are looking to the culture of the Middle East and deciding whether it should, without hesitation, allow immigration or continue with their immigration policies in the form of the refugees that are coming, which are almost entirely of the culture of Islam. So in Islam, there is a significant variation of respect inside the societies of Islam as contrasted to respect that is directed outside of its domain of the Middle East. And this is because of the Quran, that it uses as its defining scripture. It's specifically, the Quran specifically states that one is to be compassionate and understanding and cooperative, but it's relative to all those of the Islamic faith. And in contrast to that, it states to hold a different view and attitude. The Quran, it does state that those who are outside of Islam, and it defines this as those who are unbelievers, have a different. You are to behave differently to them, and there are two types of unbelievers: those that believe in the Bible, that are monotheistic, and those that do not believe in the Bible at all. And these are clearly unbelievers according to the Quran. They are to be brought forcibly into the word of Allah. But according to the Quran, for Christians and Jews and Zoroastrians, as they call them, the Quran calls them the people of the book, they are to be given the choice of either a subjugation tax, conversion to Islam, or death, and not a great set of choices. And the Islamic attitude toward those outside of the Quran is quite harsh, and thus the blanket immigration or wholesale immigration into the United States would definitely be detrimental to the good of those of cultures that of the United States and of Western Europe as well. We don't have to just look at the inside of the Quran, but we can look at the history and the ongoing clash between Islam and the West. Ever since just before Muhammad's death, the conquest of the West has been in the eyes of Islam and all of Muhammad's followers right up to today. The crusade by Islam from the time of Muhammad until now to conquer the West has been steady and numerous. Muhammad, and just to give you a brief outline, Muhammad started his first crusade against the West when he set his eyes on the Empire of Byzantium before his death, but it wasn't successful. However, his successors were successful, and they spread by the force of the sword. They spread Islam all throughout the Arabian Peninsula, into North Africa, into Spain, and all the way up to the gates of Paris, where at the Battle of Tours, Charles the Hammer Martel stopped these Islamic warriors from conquering Western civilization. And there are other Islamic crusades against the West, and the second one that we can pretty much classify as having saved Western civilization was in 1684, when Jan the Pole defeated the invading Islamic armies right at the gates, right up at the outskirts of Vienna. This probably saved Western Europe. And there's currently a current crusade against the West by means of terrorism, And this terrorism has its foundation in the Quran and in the Hadith of Muhammad, both of which state that terror is a good tool of war. Um, also, as noted in the documents of the Muslim Brotherhood, another crusade is presently in place by the nations of Islam in the exporting of migrants, whether legal or illegally, to the Western nations. And this will bring a conflicting culture into the presence of the unbelieving Western society. And if we take our notion of that which is good as that which helps us bring us up away from misery, it would appear, at least to me, that the increased presence of the adherents of Islam would not be good for any Western society and Western culture. This kind of diversity in the name of the culture of Islam, which has a history of war against the West, and it certainly would not be good. And I think we can look to England in this last week to for a little bit of guidance here. Lastly, we have to know here in this argument whether the physical culture and whether to import people that have a different cultural from ours, would it bring in goodness or not? And well, recalling that physical culture is that which we produce materially, these products are in our culture. Anything that we produce brings us up away from misery. When consumers buy something from a store, they buy it with the attitude that the product will improve their lives. Well, as societies evolve, they produce more and better and greater things that become more sophisticated. And as the sophistication of the products improve, the preponderant ingredient of these products is knowledge. And we can say unequivocally that as a society progresses, the knowledge needed to produce the greater sophistication in the products become greater and greater. Thus, we conclude that we look extraterritorially for diversity. When we do that, we should look for the diversity of greater knowledge, which would accrue to our goodness. So, when we look at immigration to increase our diversity, we should look to those people with greater knowledge. This would bring to our society greater diversity, and it would be a great thing. It would bring an increase in the accumulation of knowledge into our society or societies, and would diversify the accumulated knowledge, which is really the ultimate purpose of the political establishment. So this is one kind of diversification. So as for a rational immigration program for America, it would seem to me that the U.S. should look to bring in societies that produce more and more knowledge, as that would be beneficial for the American societies. Cultures such as Japan, China, and Western Europe are producing people with great knowledge of all sorts of academic and industrial pursuits, and this kind of diversity is certainly welcome. However, this kind of diversity does not exist in the nations of Islam, and you want to ask yourself, why is that? Nations that are preponderantly Islamic do not produce any institutions of higher learning. They do not produce any industrial leaders. They are not leaders in the production of knowledge that is needed to generate the more complicated and goods and services of the world. And so why is that? Why do the nations of Islam not produce higher knowledge on a steady, ongoing basis as other societies have done, especially those of the Far East and Western society? Well, the reason why Islam does not produce that much comparative to the production of Western and Far Eastern societies is due to competition. Now, I know that's a remarkable statement, and I can see why a viewer might go, what? Why would that be? What has competition got to do with the production of knowledge in Islamic societies? Well, competition is the convergence of two or more entities with the same priority, which is to obtain goodness by two or more life entities. And that is when two life entities see the same priority of goodness compared to the one entity seeking good. If it's two or more, the goodness tends to be divided by two. So obviously, you get less. There's less available. So when one entity centers its attention on one particular priority and another entity comes along to participate in this goodness is automatically divided in half. Thus, one of the basic dictums of economics is that all of life tries to avoid competition, especially direct competition. That is, the more life converges on the same priority, the more life entity wants to avoid direct competition, and therefore it automatically tries to diversify. So what does this have got to do with Islam? Well, all nations that are predominantly Muslim are run by a non-democratic government and mostly are governed by a theocracy. There are perhaps one or two exceptions to this. But even the exceptions are still basically totalitarian. And for example, Egypt, which is a military dictatorship, and another is probably Turkey, although Turkey is losing its democratic institutions, and they seem to be disintegrating. Well, so the reason why Islamic government does not allow for the production of higher knowledge is that this production of knowledge and information converges on the priorities of Islam and its Quran, the Hadith, and the Sunnah. And this is, and actually Christianity 600 years ago was the same way. We've all heard the stories of the Catholic Church versus Galileo. Religious doctrine doesn't like competition from philosophy, science, and the arts. In industry and commerce, which in industry and commerce it embodies the need for a production of knowledge. And but luckily, in Western society, the Catholic Church has evolved, albeit over 600 or 700 years, but it has evolved, and it's become tolerant by separating itself from politics and alleviating itself of the competition to control not only the spiritual aspects of society, but the commercial, secular, and personal aspects of society, except by proselytizing, which is fine. However, that does not appear in Islam. This could be exhibited by looking at their society, which is deficient in advanced learning. It doesn't produce any Nobel Prize winners, except maybe in peace, which is a faux prize, because no peace has ever come out from Islam. Nobody seeks to go there for their advanced learning, except courses in Arabic study or for Islamic studies. So, in conclusion, the Islamic culture cannot produce advanced knowledge because it would compete with the Islamic governance and all its consuming priorities of piety and study of Allah. It just exports the ideology of war to those who are not of the Islamic faith. So regarding this diversity of which the politicians speak, it seems that it's detrimental to import those of the Islamic culture. Rick, what do you think?
Well, I would I would start with the U.S. Constitution in addressing this subject, which is silent on immigration. The importance of that is that this is entirely the province of executive and legislative fiat. If the American people decide tomorrow there will be no immigration to the United States, none from anywhere, it is within their right. That's point number one. Point number two is that, and this is pretty inconvenient for immigration advocates, over the last 25 years, we've had unprecedented levels of immigration. And all that time, the household income levels have largely stagnated. And so the argument that massive immigration somehow enhances the well-being of the existing populace is challenged, actually. The evidence is very mixed, and certainly not persuasive. There is no doubt that it benefits the immigrants coming in, but that it benefits the taxpayers already living here is open to considerable debate. And in fact, a number of abuses have been documented, including H-1B visas, which bring in IT workers, many from India, to work at places like Microsoft and Google, where it's documented that they're paid less and they can't leave. And that's why they get the jobs over American citizens. Equally, it's also documented at companies like Disney that foreigners have been brought in to displace Americans who then lose their jobs. So the whole subject of immigration, never mind that of the uneducated classes, but even with the educated classes, is one that's fraught. And it does not, at the moment, and has not for the last 20, 25 years, inclined to a reading that this has benefited the existing citizenry. And that's one reason you're seeing such a reaction against it. Finally, on the subject of Muslim immigration, if the American people, through their representatives, decide that they want any immigration at all, and I stress that it is within their right to cut it off completely, then the executive branch is certainly within its right, along with the legislative branch, to impose whatever strictures and or scrutiny they think is required to ensure that the existing citizenry remain as safe as possible. And if that means that Muslims or representatives of certain countries are subjected to increased scrutiny or denied access to immigration to the United States entirely, so be it. That is within their right.
Do you have any advice or suggestions for in regard to the terrorism that we've seen in England this in the last few days? Do you have any advice for what should the British government do? What should the people of England demand of its government in response to this, if anything? What do you think?
Well, in England and other places in Europe, there are locations where Sharia law has been adopted, where there's a parallel court system. And this obviously panders to the notion that you're going to have kind of a parallel civilization in your midst. This is absurd. And it's diametrically opposed to the long-standing tradition of common law, where the same laws apply to everybody equally. And unless you're going to protect that broadly Western standard, and more particularly English/American/Commonwealth standard, then it's not surprising that you have people coming to believe and justified in believing that they should act in accordance with Muslim principles in the midst of a Western democracy. Because in a sense, these Western governments, in England, including England, have put their imprimatur on that notion by allowing this to happen.
Okay. But what should, going forward, be the policy of the English government now? How should they combat their present predicament of possible violence within their country of these homemade bombs?
Well, I think they have to make the consequences ever more severe for breaking the law, and police accordingly. And that means extra scrutiny on the mosques, if that means extra scrutiny on the imams, if that that are planting the seeds of this kind of activity, so be it. Because the number one priority of any government has to be to protect its existing citizenry.
Exactly. And I think that's really the nub of the problem right there. The governments have not been considering that as their primary purpose, and they're in for being. And so with that said, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us on the Philosophical Angle program, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.